The burning wreckage of American battleships still smoldered in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor when Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto began planning what he believed would be Japan's knockout blow against the United States. In his quarters aboard, the flagship Yamato, the architect of Japan's early Pacific victories, gazed at maps of Midway Atoll, a tiny pair of islands that would soon become the stage for one of history's most decisive naval engagements. "We have awakened a sleeping giant," Yamamoto had allegedly warned after Pearl Harbor, and now, in the spring of 1942, he sought to cripple that giant before it could fully rise. The American naval presence in the Pacific had been devastated on December 7, 1941. 8 battleships, the pride of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, lay damaged or destroyed. 3,429 American servicemen and civilians were dead. The shocking attack had catapulted the United States into World War II, but Japan's initial advantage seemed overwhelming. In the 5 months following Pearl Harbor, Imperial Japanese forces had swept through the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies with terrifying efficiency. The rising sun flag now flew over a vast new empire stretching across the Western Pacific. Yet one critical element had escaped Japan's grasp at Pearl Harbor: America's aircraft carriers. By sheer fortune, the USS Enterprise, Lexington, and Hornet had been at sea during the attack. This stroke of luck would prove pivotal in the coming confrontation. The Japanese success at Pearl Harbor was tactically brilliant, but strategically incomplete, notes naval historian Craig Simons in his definitive work, The Battle of Midway. Had they destroyed our carrier force alongside our battleships, the Pacific War might have followed a very different course. Admiral Chester Nimitz, newly appointed commander of the Pacific Fleet, faced a daunting challenge. With America's battleship force out of action, he had to rely on his precious carriers and find ways to slow the Japanese advance with limited resources. Intelligence would prove to be his most valuable weapon. At Station Hypio in the basement of the administration building at Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort led an extraordinary team of codebreakers working around the clock to penetrate Japanese naval communications. Their work was grueling, combining cryptanalysis, traffic analysis, and intuitive leaps to extract meaning from intercepted transmissions. By April 1942, they had partially broken the Japanese naval code known as JN-25B, but critical gaps remained. Meanwhile, Admiral Yamamoto's strategic vision centered on drawing out and destroying America's remaining carriers. His plan called for a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, followed by an invasion of Midway Atoll, the northwesternmost outpost of Hawaii. When American carriers rushed to Midway's defense, the Imperial Japanese Navy would spring its trap with overwhelming force. The Japanese combined fleet assembled for this operation was awe-inspiring. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, 2 light carriers, 7 battleships, 15 cruisers, 42 destroyers, and a host of support vessels. Commanding this armada was Admiral Yamamoto himself, aboard the super battleship Yamato, at 72,000 tons, the largest warship ever built. In late May, as Japanese forces began their complex deployment across the Pacific, Rochefort's codebreakers achieved a crucial breakthrough. They determined that a location designated as AF in Japanese messages was Midway. To confirm this, Nimitz approved a clever ruse. Midway sent an uncoded message claiming their water distillation plant had broken down. Within days, Japanese communications mentioned that AF was short of fresh water. The trap that Yamamoto had so carefully planned was about to be turned against him. Armed with precise knowledge of Japanese intentions, Admiral Nimitz positioned his outnumbered forces, the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, along with their escorts, northeast of Midway, placing them perfectly to ambush the approaching Japanese fleet. As dawn broke on June 4, 1942, the fate of the Pacific War hung in the balance. What followed would be described by military historian John Keegan as the most stunning and decisive blow in the history of naval warfare. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 4, 1942, the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean concealed 2 naval forces on a collision course with destiny. Admiral Nagumo Chuichi, commander of the Japanese 1st Carrier Striking Force, had positioned his 4 fleet carriers approximately 200 miles northwest of Midway. His mission was clear: launch airstrikes to neutralize the American base, draw out the U.S. carriers, and destroy them with Japan's superior naval aviation. Nagumo was a capable officer who had led the Pearl Harbor attack with precision, but he was also cautious by nature, a trait that would soon prove fateful. His force comprised the pride of Japan's carrier fleet, the Akagi, his flagship, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Together, these 4 vessels carried over 200 aircraft, crewed by the Imperial Navy's most experienced pilots. Japan's naval aviators in 1942 represented the finest carrier air groups in the world, writes historian Jonathan Parshall in Shattered Sword, the untold story of the Battle of Midway. With an average of 800 flight hours per pilot, compared to about 300 for their American counterparts, and combat experience gained in China and the early Pacific campaigns, they had every reason for confidence. Unknown. To Nagumo, Admiral Nimitz had positioned Task Force 16 and Task Force 17, centered around the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, northeast of Midway. The Yorktown's presence was itself remarkable. Damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just 1 month earlier, emergency repairs at Pearl Harbor had made her seaworthy in an astonishing 72 hours instead of the estimated 90 days. Admirals Raymond Spruance commanded Task Force 16, while Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, the senior officer present, led Task Force 17 and held overall tactical command. Neither had extensive carrier warfare experience, but both possessed the clear thinking and decisiveness that would prove crucial in the coming hours. At 0434, a PBY Catalina flying boat on dawn patrol spotted the Japanese carrier force. "Enemy carriers sighted," crackled over the radio, triggering immediate action across the American forces. At Midway itself, Major General Harold Martin ordered every available aircraft into the air. Meanwhile, on Midway's tiny eastern island, radar operators tracked the approach of the first Japanese attack wave, 108 bombers and fighters launched from Nagumo's carriers. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Shannon, commanding Midway's ground defenses, knew his Marines faced overwhelming odds. "The men were calm but intensely focused," he later wrote. "We all understood this might be our last stand." The first Japanese strike hit Midway at 0630. Despite heavy anti-aircraft fire, Japanese bombers methodically targeted the island's facilities while Zero fighters strafed defensive positions. The damage was substantial but not decisive. Crucially, the airfield remained operational. As the Japanese aircraft completed their bombing runs and turned back toward their carriers, they radioed Nagumo a critical assessment. A second strike against Midway would be necessary. This message precipitated what historian Samuel Eliot Morison called the fatal 5 minutes of the battle. Nagumo faced a complex dilemma. His reserve aircraft had been armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for naval combat, anticipating an encounter with American ships. Switching to land attack weapons would require time. Moreover, scout planes had reported an unidentified American naval force, though they had not yet spotted the U.S. carriers. At 0720, Nagumo made his decision. He ordered the reserve aircraft on Akagi and Kaga to be rearmed with land attack weapons for a second strike on Midway. The flight decks became scenes of intense activity as ordnance teams brought torpedoes back to the hangars and began installing high-explosive bombs instead. Meanwhile, the Americans had launched their counterstrikes. From Midway itself came a hodgepodge of aircraft: Marine Corps SBD Dauntless dive bombers, obsolete SB-2U Vindicators, and slow TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, heading directly for the Japanese carriers. From the American carriers came the more substantial threat: torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters launched in scattered groups rather than as a coordinated strike force. The stage was now set for what naval historian Craig Simons describes as 3 hours of combat that would change the course of the war. As American and Japanese aircraft crisscrossed the vast Pacific sky in search of their targets, neither side fully grasped how completely the fate of nations now hung in the balance. The morning sun climbed higher over the Pacific as American aircraft from Midway and the 3 carriers sought their targets with desperate determination. The first to find the Japanese fleet were the torpedo bombers, slow, vulnerable aircraft that needed to fly straight and level at low altitude to launch their weapons. Leading Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet was Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, who had told his pilots before takeoff, "If only one plane is left, I want that man to go in and get a hit." Waldron's 15 TBD Devastators found Nagumo's carriers at approximately 0920. Without fighter escort, the American F-4F Wildcats had become separated during the flight. Torpedo 8 faced the full fury of Japan's combat air patrol. Zero fighters, piloted by veterans of the China conflict and Pearl Harbor attack, tore into the American formation. The result was slaughter. One by one, the torpedo bombers were shot down in flames. Of the 15 aircraft and 30 men of Torpedo Squadron 8, only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the ocean near enough to witness the battle's next phase. We have documented that American air crews displayed almost suicidal courage. At Midway, notes historian Robert Cressman in a glorious page in our history, Waldron's squadron was annihilated without scoring a single hit, yet their sacrifice would soon prove not to have been in vain. Following Torpedo 8 came the equally ill-fated attacks by Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise and Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown. Though a few aircraft managed to launch their torpedoes, none found their targets. By 10 o'clock, the Americans had lost 35 torpedo bombers with nothing to show for the sacrifice. On the Japanese carriers, cheers erupted as the last attacker disappeared in flames. Yet these seemingly futile attacks produced a decisive, unintended consequence. The repeated torpedo bomber assaults had drawn the Japanese Zero fighters down to wave-top level and scattered them across miles of ocean. More importantly, the constant air attacks had prevented Nagumo from launching his own aircraft, with Japanese hangars still crowded with bombers in the process of rearming. At 10 o'clock and 25 minutes, the pivotal moment of the Pacific, war arrived without warning. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bombers, had nearly reached the limit of his fuel supply without finding the enemy, making what historian John Lundstrom called the most important tactical decision of the Pacific War. McCluskey followed his instinct and the wake of a Japanese destroyer, finally sighting Nagumo's carriers at 10:25. High above the Japanese fleet, unseen in the sun's glare, 3 squadrons of American SBD Dauntless dive bombers had arrived simultaneously, 37 from Enterprise under McCluskey and 17 from Yorktown under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie. In a stroke of timing that military historian Gordon Prange called almost beyond the realm of coincidence, they found the Japanese carriers with flight decks full of aircraft, bombs, and fuel. The dive bombers pushed over into near-vertical dives, their windscreens filled with the enormous targets below. Captain Richard Best, commanding Enterprise's Bombing 6 Squadron, recalled the moment. "It was like watching a movie in slow motion. I could see every detail on Akagi's deck as we dove, the men running, the aircraft parked wing to wing. Within 6 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers had been hit with multiple 1,000-pound bombs. The Akagi, struck by Best's bomb near the midship elevator, erupted as fires ignited fueled and armed aircraft. The Kaga, hit by at least 4 bombs, became an inferno as secondary explosions tore through her hangar deck. The Soryu, attacked by Yorktown's dive bombers, suffered 3 bomb hits that ignited catastrophic fires fed by ruptured aviation fuel lines. According to naval historian Jonathan Parshall, the organizational structure of Japanese carriers, with wooden flight decks, limited firefighting capability, and poor damage control procedures, virtually ensured that serious bomb hits would prove fatal. By 11 o'clock, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers were ablaze from stem to stern. Only the Hiryu, positioned apart from the formation, remained operational. Her commander, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, immediately launched a counterattack with the carrier's remaining aircraft. At noon, these planes found the Yorktown and scored 3 bomb hits and 2 torpedo strikes that eventually led to her loss. But the American advantage was now overwhelming. Late that afternoon, dive bombers from Enterprise located and attacked the Hiryu, scoring 4 direct hits that transformed the last Japanese carrier into a flaming wreck. Admiral Yamaguchi chose to go down with his ship, a decision that deprived Japan of one of its most capable carrier commanders. As darkness fell on June 4th, the strategic balance in the Pacific had been irrevocably altered. In the space of a single day, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers and over 3,000 sailors and aviators, including most of their elite, irreplaceable pilot corps. At Pearl Harbor, we lost ships but saved our men, noted Admiral Nimitz afterward. At Midway, the Japanese lost ships and men both. As dawn broke on June 5, 1942, the Pacific waters north of Midway bore silent witness to the previous day's carnage. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, now lay as burning hulks, or had already slipped, beneath the waves. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had never suffered a significant defeat in its modern history, had lost the core of its striking power in just a few hours of combat. Admiral Yamamoto, receiving the devastating news aboard the battleship Yamato, faced the most difficult decision of his career. The original plan had called for Japanese surface forces to bombard Midway and engage any American naval units in a decisive night battle, a type of combat in which the Japanese excelled. His force still included powerful battleships and cruisers that could have continued the operation. Yet without air cover, these vessels would be vulnerable to American carrier aircraft. Yamamoto's dilemma illustrated how completely carrier warfare had transformed naval strategy, explains historian H.P. Wilmot in The Barrier and the Javelin. The mightiest battleships afloat were now effectively neutered without air protection. The era of the battleship as the queen of the seas had ended, though not all naval leaders were ready to accept this reality. After hours of deliberation, Yamamoto issued the order to retreat. The Midway operation, envisioned as the masterstroke that would eliminate American naval power in the Pacific, had instead become a catastrophic defeat. The Japanese combined fleet turned westward and began its long journey home, leaving behind floating debris, oil slicks, and shattered strategic ambitions. For the Americans, the aftermath of victory brought both elation and sobering assessments. The USS Yorktown, damaged but initially salvageable, was torpedoed by the Japanese submarine I-168 on June 7th and finally sank the following day. The carrier and destroyer Hammond were the only major American vessels lost in the battle, compared to the 4 carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, and 332 aircraft lost by Japan. More significant than the material losses were the casualties among Japan's naval aviators. Over 150 of Japan's most experienced pilots had perished, men with irreplaceable skills and experience. Japan's naval air groups never fully recovered from this blow. In contrast, while American casualties were substantial, 307 men killed, the United States possessed the industrial capacity and training programs to replace both men and machines. According to historian John Keegan in The Price of Admiralty, Midway represented not just a tactical defeat for Japan, but a strategic catastrophe. The Imperial Navy had lost its offensive capability in a single afternoon, and with it any realistic hope of winning the Pacific War. Admiral Nimitz, in his official report to Navy headquarters in Washington, recognized the battle's significance. Pearl Harbor has now been partially avenged. Vengeance will not be complete until Japanese sea power has been reduced to impotence. His words proved prophetic. Midway had indeed marked the high-water mark of Japanese expansion and the beginning of a long, grinding retreat. The news of the American victory spread quickly through the Allied nations, providing a desperately needed morale boost. For 6 months, the headlines had carried an unrelenting stream of defeats and disasters. Now, at last, there was cause for genuine optimism. President Franklin Roosevelt, addressing the American people in a fireside chat on June 12th, carefully avoided specific details of the battle for security reasons, but conveyed its importance. The significance of this victory cannot be overstated. We have stopped the Japanese advance and begun the long road back. In Tokyo, the Japanese government concealed the extent of the disaster from its people. Official announcements mentioned only that the combined fleet had engaged the Americans with mixed results and claimed the sinking of 2 enemy carriers. The true scale of the defeat was known only to senior military and government officials, who now faced the daunting prospect of fighting a defensive war against an increasingly powerful enemy. Emperor Hirohito, upon learning the full details of the battle, reportedly asked a simple, devastating question: how will we fight now? The answer would unfold across 3 years of increasingly desperate combat as Japan sought to establish a defensive perimeter strong enough to force a negotiated peace. For the United States, Midway provided something equally valuable: time. The destruction of Japan's carrier force meant that the Hawaiian Islands, and by extension the American West Coast, were no longer under immediate threat. This security allowed American industrial mobilization to proceed unhindered, producing the ships, aircraft, and weapons that would eventually overwhelm Japanese defenses. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, summed up the strategic importance in a memo to President Roosevelt. Midway has given us breathing space and a psychological lift precisely when both were most needed. We must now capitalize on this success to seize the initiative permanently. Within weeks of the battle, planning began for America's first offensive operation in the Pacific War, the invasion of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, scheduled for August 1942. The long road to Tokyo had begun. By midsummer 1942, the strategic implications of the Battle of Midway were becoming clear to military planners on both sides of the Pacific. What had begun as a tactical encounter between carrier forces had evolved into a strategic inflection point that would influence every subsequent campaign of the Pacific War. For Japan, the immediate consequence was a halt to eastward expansion. Plans for operations against New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa, stepping stones toward cutting the supply line between America and Australia, were shelved indefinitely. The offensive momentum that had carried Japanese forces across half the Pacific now stalled, never to be regained. The ripple effects of Midway extended far beyond the immediate battle, writes historian Ronald Spector in Eagle Against the Sun. Japan's entire strategic position shifted from offensive to defensive virtually overnight, forcing a complete reassessment of war plans that had been predicated on continued naval superiority. Within the Imperial Japanese Navy, the loss created both practical and psychological traumas that would hamper operations throughout the war. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the first wave attack on Pearl Harbor and survived Midway after being grounded with appendicitis, later wrote, "Our defeat at Midway was truly the turning point of the Pacific War, though few men in the fleet could then glimpse the implications. Most damaging was the Imperial Navy's decision to conceal the extent of the defeat, even from the Japanese Army leadership. This institutional dishonesty reinforced the already problematic rivalry between Japan's military services and prevented a clear-eyed assessment of the nation's deteriorating strategic position. For the United States, Midway's effects were equally profound but overwhelmingly positive. Admiral Ernest King seized upon the victory to advocate for a Pacific-first strategy in America's two-front war. While the Roosevelt administration maintained its Germany-first commitment, the triumph at Midway secured additional resources for Pacific operations that might otherwise have been directed to Europe. According to historian Craig Simons, Midway didn't change the Allied grand strategy, but it certainly accelerated the timetable for offensive operations in the Pacific. Without the elimination of Japan's carrier advantage, the Guadalcanal campaign might have been delayed by months or even a year. The psychological impact on American forces cannot be overstated. Naval aviator Lieutenant John Bridgers captured the sentiment in a letter home. Before Midway, it seemed the Japanese couldn't be stopped. After Midway, it seemed they couldn't win. The difference in outlook was like night and day. This renewed confidence influenced the next major engagement of the Pacific War, the 6-month struggle for Guadalcanal that began in August 1942. Though outnumbered and operating at the end of a tenuous supply line, American Marines and sailors fought with the knowledge that they had already beaten Japan's best at Midway. The battle's impact extended beyond military considerations to affect industrial and training priorities as well. The stellar performance of the SBD Dauntless dive bombers led to increased production of these aircraft, while the poor showing of the obsolete TBD Devastator torpedo bombers accelerated their replacement with the improved TBF Avenger. More significantly, the United States intensified its carrier construction program. The Essex-class carriers, massive improvements over pre-war designs, began joining the fleet in 1943, eventually numbering 24 ships. Japan, with its more limited industrial capacity, completed only one fleet carrier. After Midway, the battle also transformed naval aviation training. As Jonathan Parshall notes in Shattered Sword, Japan's decision to keep experienced pilots in combat units, rather than rotating them to training duties, meant the loss at Midway created a talent vacuum they could never fill. In contrast, American aces were systematically rotated back to training commands, where they passed their combat experience to new pilots. Admiral Nimitz understood this dynamic clearly. In September 1942, he instituted a formal rotation policy for experienced aircrews, writing, "We must harvest the lessons of Midway by ensuring that the knowledge gained in combat is systematically transferred to those who will fight tomorrow's battles." For the Japanese leadership, Midway forced a strategic reassessment that led to what historian John Toland called the strategy of hope. Unable to replace their carrier losses quickly, they adopted a defensive perimeter strategy centered on fortified island bases. The plan called for inflicting such heavy casualties on attacking American forces that the United States would eventually seek a negotiated peace rather than pay the bloody price of total victory. Emperor Hirohito, in a rare direct intervention in military planning, questioned this approach during an imperial conference in July 1942. According to minutes of the meeting, he asked, "If we could not defeat the Americans with our advantage at the war's beginning, how can we expect to defeat them now that they grow stronger each day while we grow weaker?" The question went unanswered, but its implications haunted Japanese planning for the remainder of the war. Perhaps the most profound strategic effect of Midway was how it shaped the war's timeline. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison estimated that the American victory advanced the Pacific timetable by at least a year. Without the decisive carrier advantage gained at Midway, the island-hopping campaign would have proceeded more cautiously and taken longer to reach Japan's home islands. This acceleration had profound implications beyond the Pacific theater. By shortening the war against Japan, Midway indirectly affected the emerging Cold War dynamics in Europe and Asia. When American forces finally occupied Japan in September 1945, they did so before Soviet forces could establish a significant presence in the defeated empire, a circumstance that might have been different had the Pacific War dragged on longer. As 1942 drew to a close, Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor who had predicted Japan could run wild for 6 months but no more, found his prophecy fulfilled with uncanny accuracy. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Midway had indeed turned the tide. On September 2, 1945, representatives of the Japanese government stood on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay to sign the instrument of surrender, formally ending World War II. The path to this moment had been long and bloody, but many of the officers present that day understood that the decisive turn had come more than 3 years earlier, at a tiny atoll in the Central Pacific. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who signed the surrender document as the United States representative, had risen to prominence through his leadership after Midway. In a private moment before the ceremony, he reportedly told his staff, "The war was won on June 4, 1942. We just had to finish the job." While this assessment might seem overstated, most military historians agree that Midway represented the strategic hinge upon which the Pacific War turned. Japan never recovered from the loss of 4 fleet carriers and hundreds of irreplaceable aviators. Though 3 more years of fierce fighting lay ahead, including desperate battles at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the initiative had permanently shifted to the Allied forces. In the decades since, the Battle of Midway has been studied extensively for its tactical lessons and strategic significance. The battle highlighted several enduring principles of warfare that continue to influence modern military thinking. Midway demonstrated the critical importance of intelligence in modern warfare, explains historian Edwin Layton, who served as Nimitz's intelligence officer during the battle. Without the code-breaking breakthrough, American forces would almost certainly have been surprised and defeated. This lesson was not lost on post-war military planners, who greatly expanded signals intelligence capabilities in subsequent decades. The battle also underscored the value of training, adaptability, and decision-making under pressure. Admiral Nagumo's fatal delay in launching his reserve aircraft, stemmed partly from the rigid nature of Japanese naval doctrine, which left subordinate commanders with little flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. In contrast, American commanders like Spruance and Fletcher made critical decisions quickly based on incomplete information and proved correct enough times to secure victory. According to contemporary military analyst Milan Vago, Midway remains a textbook example of how superior decision-making can overcome numerical disadvantage. The American commander's willingness to accept calculated risks at critical moments stands in stark contrast to the more cautious Japanese approach, which sacrificed opportunity on the altar of certainty. The technological and tactical innovations, showcased at Midway, also left a lasting legacy. The decisive role played by aircraft carriers confirmed their ascendance as the principal capital ships of modern navies, a status they maintain to this day. The effectiveness of dive bombing against ships demonstrated the vulnerability of surface vessels to air attack, accelerating the development of naval air defenses and carrier-based fighter protection. The revolution in naval warfare that began at Midway continues to shape fleet architecture in the 21st century, notes naval historian Norman Friedman in Carrier Air Power. Modern carrier strike groups, with their layered defenses and integrated air wings, are direct descendants of the forces that clashed north of Midway Atoll. For the Japanese military, Midway offered lessons that came too late to alter the war's outcome but influenced post-war doctrine. The battle exposed critical weaknesses in damage control procedures, aircraft carrier design, and pilot replacement systems, all of which received careful attention in Japan's post-war maritime self-defense. Perhaps most significantly, Midway demonstrated the decisive impact of industrial capacity on modern warfare. Japan's inability to replace its carrier losses quickly contrasted sharply with America's ability to commission the new Essex-class carriers at the rate of almost one per month by 1944. The battle revealed the fundamental strategic problem facing Japan, writes historian Paul Kennedy in Engineers of Victory. No tactical brilliance could ultimately overcome the vast disparity in industrial output between Japan and the United States. After Midway removed Japan's early qualitative edge in carrier operations, the quantitative superiority of American production proved insurmountable. For the American public, Midway provided something equally valuable: hope during a dark period of the war. The victory came at a time when German U-boats were devastating Allied shipping in the Atlantic, Rommel's Africa Corps was advancing toward Egypt, and Soviet forces were reeling from Operation Barbarossa. The triumph at Midway offered tangible proof that Axis forces could be defeated through courage, planning, and determination. President Roosevelt, though careful with operational details for security reasons, made certain the American public understood the significance of what had occurred. In a radio address on June 18th, he proclaimed, "A great American naval victory in the Coral Sea, has transformed the situation in the Pacific. The enemy has been checked, and American arms have proven their quality." The legacy of Midway extends beyond military affairs into popular culture and national memory. The battle has been portrayed in numerous films, books, and documentaries, from the 1949 film Task Force to the 20th century movies Midway, released in 1976 and 2019. These depictions have helped cement the battle's place in American historical consciousness as a moment when courage and determination overcame seemingly insurmountable odds. For the men who fought there, Midway remained the defining experience of their lives. Dive bomber pilot Richard Best, whose perfectly placed bomb struck the Akagi's flight deck, spoke for many when he reflected 50 years later. "We were ordinary men placed in extraordinary circumstances. None of us knew we were making history. We were just trying to survive and do our duty. That our actions helped change the course of the war only became clear much later." The Battle of Midway stands today as a testament to the often thin margin between victory and defeat in warfare, and how a brief moment of combat can alter the trajectory of global history. In just 6 minutes on the morning of June 4, 1942, the strategic balance of the Pacific War shifted irreversibly, setting in motion events that would ultimately lead to Allied victory and shape the post-war world. As historian, John Keegan concluded in his analysis of pivotal battles in world history, Midway belongs in that small category of battles that can truly be called decisive. Encounters that not only determine the outcome of a particular war, but also influence the course of human events for generations to come.